This is Curious Minnesota, a Star Tribune project that sends staff from the state's largest newsroom hunting for the answers to great questions we receive from you, our readers. We're here to answer everything you want to know about the state's people, places, and culture.
Welcome to Curious Minnesota. I'm your host, Eric Roper. Today we're going to be talking about the tremendous courage displayed by a group of Minnesotans at what is probably the most famous battle ever fought on American soil, the Battle of Gettysburg. Some believe that this pivotal Civil War battle could have ended very differently were it not for the sacrifices made by the young men of the First Minnesota Volunteer Infantry regiment. Several readers contacted Curious Minnesota wanting to know more about this event and why it isn't more celebrated both here in Minnesota and more generally like in the 1993 film Gettysburg, which doesn't mention the First Minnesota. We're talking today with the Star Tribune's Kevin Duchschere, who wrote a great story on the topic for Curious Minnesota that I will link to in the show notes. But first, let's hear from one of the readers whose question inspired that story, Bob Halpert.
I'm a history buff, and my great-great-grandfather was part of the 9th Minnesota. But just going through the history and going through the Civil War battles, it just occurred to me that we had a group of Minnesota farm boys and merchants taking action during the pivotal battle of the Civil War. And they did a very heroic thing. Most of them paid for it with their lives, and they probably saved the Union and the battle. But here in Minnesota, it seems like there's no recognition of it. That, you think that this would be something we talk about on the 4th of July or have ceremonies or things to cover, but we have no recognition of it, and that's what kind of surprises me, that Minnesotans did a very important thing and nobody talks about it.
Well, Kevin, thanks so much for joining us today. So we're going to tell this heroic story about these men who went off to die at Gettysburg and made a huge sacrifice. But let's sort of set the stage a bit. The beginning of the war, 1861, Minnesota was just barely a state, right? So what's going on here when that all begins?
Yeah, Minnesota was only 3 years old. At the time, there were only 172,000 residents in the state, but it just so happened that Governor Alexander Ramsey was in Washington, D.C. on the day that the South fired on Fort Sumter and ignited the war. And what he did was he went to the White House right away to see President Lincoln and pledged 1,000 soldiers to defend the country, and thus the First Minnesota Regiment was born.
Okay. And so there ended up being 11 regiments, you write in the story, some of whom fought in the U.S.-Dakota War and some of whom fought in the Civil War, right? So this is just one of a number of regiments.
Yeah. The difference being that most of the Minnesota regiments that fought in the Civil War fought in the South, in Tennessee, Mississippi, and Arkansas. The 1st Minnesota was the only regiment among the Minnesota's regiments to fight in the famous Eastern battles that we all hear about, Antietam, Fredericksburg, and, of course, Gettysburg.
Okay. And so you also know in the story, these are farm youth, loggers, clerks. I guess you mentioned that to sort of just show the diverse, these are young people, but they come from sort of diverse jobs and things here in Minnesota.
Yeah, they were, young men. Some of them were fired by the romance of going to war. I think they lost that point of view rather quickly. Some of them were looking for a steady paycheck. Some of them might have been at loose ends and decided, and some of them were motivated by the whole aspect behind the reasons for the war, about slavery and the rest.
Right. So we're going to get into the specifics of their sacrifice at Gettysburg. But let's talk about Gettysburg for a second. So I'm not a student of the Civil War that much. I know a little bit about it, but I know that Gettysburg, to me, if someone were to ask what's the most famous battle at the Civil War, I would say Gettysburg, just maybe because of the Gettysburg Address or whatever. But tell us about the significance of this battle.
Well, it really was the turning point of the war. The Confederacy had been making some advances in Virginia, but they never got farther than Gettysburg in terms of invading the North, and they were turned back there. And of course, the war would continue for another couple years, but Gettysburg was about as far as they got. And it was a 3-day battle. It was a terribly violent and dramatic battle, as most battles, I suppose, are. But the fact that the Union held fast and that the Confederate troops under General Lee had to fall back to Virginia and Maryland gave the Union the breathing space it needed to go on from there.
Okay, so it's the Battle of Gettysburg is going on. It's a 3-day battle, and so day 2 is the part that we're going to focus on. So the First Minnesota is sort of ready for action. And what happens? Give us the blow by blow here.
Well, what happened was, as you said, it was the second day at Gettysburg, and there was a threatened break in the Union line. In the center of the Union line, actually. And General Winfield Scott Hancock was on the field, and he saw that it was going to take a few minutes to bring up reinforcements from the Union rear.
So basically the defensive line had a hole in it.
To bolster the line, that's right. But how to buy that time? Well, he looked around, and the only regiment in sight was the First Minnesota, 262 of them. And he saw what needed to happen. And so he yelled to he asked Colonel Colville, William Colville, who was in charge of the 1st Minnesota, which regiment this was. And Colville responded, the 1st Minnesota. And Hancock said, charge those lines. Mm-hmm. And so the Minnesotans fixed bayonets to the end of their rifles and drove down the slope at the Alabamians, who numbered about 1,500. So there are 262 Minnesotans against 1,500 Alabamians,
right?
Which is a near suicidal type attack. Mm-hmm. And what happened was 15 minutes later, after the fighting ended, only 47 of the Minnesotans were still standing.
Wow.
The rest of them were either dead or wounded.
Oh, okay. And basically, was it a success? I mean, obviously there was a lot of casualties, but was the mission successful?
Yes. What they did was they surprised the Alabamians. They blunted the Confederate attack, and the Union center did hold. And news of what the Minnesota did was well known on the battlefield in the days after.
Okay. And I'll just note in the story, there's a lot of interesting things in there, but we have a YouTube clip in there that's kind of fascinating, which shows an aerial view of this and the different regiments moving around. So if you just want to visualize this, it's kind of interesting to look at it that way. So, okay. And then these people who were still standing, they came back the next day, right? I mean, they were still moving.
Yeah, the ones that had survived helped to blunt the famous charge by General George Pickett of the Confederacy, and along the way captured a Virginia regimental battle flag, the same flag that Governor Jesse Ventura refused to turn back to the Virginia legislature when they asked him for it in 2000.
Oh, okay, interesting. So the point of this story was we had people write us asking, why isn't the 1st Minnesota Regiment's sacrifice better remembered? And so you're a bit of a student of Civil War stuff, it seems. I mean, you've been to the battlefield, you've read a lot of the books, so you're a perfect person for this story. So first of all, I think the questioners one of them specifically based it on the movie Gettysburg that the 1st Minnesota is not mentioned there. But sort of paint a picture for us a little bit about, how was this event remembered as far as like the legacy of Gettysburg? How was the Minnesota contribution remembered in that legacy? And is it true that maybe we were a bit undercut in that way?
Well, that's not really true. The 1st Minnesota has been well remembered as one of the leading stories of the battle at Gettysburg. And in the state capitol in St. Paul, you can see a painting of the 1st Minnesota charge in the governor's reception room. There's a statue of Colonel Colville in the rotunda of the Capitol. On the battlefield itself, there's a very prominent monument of a bronze statue of a Union soldier running double quick, gripping his rifle towards the Alabamians. And that's a familiar tour stop for those taking the tour out in Gettysburg. Mm-hmm. But in recent years, it has, in fact, been less remembered. And in many ways, its place was taken by the story of the 20th Maine, which was a centerpiece of the 1975 novel by Michael Shera, The Killer Angels, which features the 20th Maine prominently for its charge on Little Round Top. And then that was the same regiment that was portrayed in the movie in the 90s called Gettysburg.
Okay.
So in some ways, the 1st Minnesota has been well remembered, but it's been overshadowed by other actions on the battlefield.
And so if Minnesotans are, if they're in the Pennsylvania area, should they go and see the Gettysburg battle site? Is it? I mean, it's a pretty elaborate historic landmark, right? And then will there be is there a lot of Minnesota? Not that Minnesotans need Minnesota stuff to go see when they're at a historic landmark, but is there some local color there that they might be able
Oh, yeah. No, the Minnesota Monument is very prominent on the battlefield. And like I said, for years and years and years, including today, I believe that it is a tour stop.
Popular tour stop.
A popular tour stop. It's a great story.
Yeah.
The First Minnesota suffered the largest number of casualties of any regiment during the Civil War. And so it's
as a percentage, or
as a percentage, yes, as a percentage. So it's a rather sobering record, and yet it's a record that Minnesotans have been properly proud of.
One thing that was interesting to me when because I help assemble all the visuals for these stories, and the veterans of the First Minnesota Regiment, the ones who survived, I mean, they obviously lived into old age, and there was a lot of pictures of them as old men. I mean, they're going back in the 1890s to dedicate the landmark. I mean, they were still around into the 1900s, right?
Yeah. You're right. In 1897, it was about 160 First Minnesota veterans boarded trains in Minneapolis to dedicate the memorial at Gettysburg. And I think the last reunion of Union and Confederate soldiers at Gettysburg was in 1913, if you can believe that. I guess my point is that, yes, there were reunions held by these veterans who were in their 80s. And it's worth noting, too, Eric, that Minnesota had the last surviving Union member, who was a Duluth man named Albert Wolson. Mm-hmm. He was the last known living Union veteran when he died in 1956.
Okay.
At the age of 106.
Wow. Wow. Well, fascinating. Well, Kevin, thank you so much. This is an interesting history. I'm sure if you go to school, and if you grow up in Minnesota and you go to school here, I'm sure you learn this in your classrooms and stuff. I didn't grow up here, so I didn't get this. I just hear allusions to the First Minnesota and Gettysburg, and I never really got the full story. I could have sought it out. I didn't. But this story really filled me in on all the details. And people should read even more of those details in your story online, which we'll link to.
Well, I was happy to have the chance to fill you in, Eric, and the rest of our readers and listeners.
Totally. All right. Well, thanks for coming, Kevin.
Good to be with you.
All right, folks. That's it for today's show. Are you enjoying this podcast? Well, do me a favor. And can you please tell a friend about it? Any help you can provide to spread the word about this show is much appreciated. And if you have thoughts about the show or would like to submit a question for us to tackle here at Curious Minnesota, shoot me an email at curious@startribune.com. Thanks.
Thanks for listening to Curious Minnesota. We want to hear from you. Ask questions and read more stories online at startribune.com/curious. Our show is recorded at the Star Tribune's headquarters in beautiful downtown Minneapolis, and our music is produced by Matt Gilmer. If you like the show, please rate us on iTunes or leave a review. And until next time, stay curious.